The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window. Reflection stared back at her from the glass, revealing the exhaustion that no amount of concealer could hide. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of hospital visits, hushed conversations with doctors, and sleepless nights spent researching treatment options that seemed to offer little hope. Prince William had already left for an early morning meeting with palace officials. The weight of duty never stopped, even when their personal world was crumbling. Catherine knew he was struggling too, though he tried to hide it behind his usual composed exterior. She had caught him several times standing in their private study, staring blankly at official documents, his mind clearly elsewhere. The diagnosis had come 3 weeks ago, delivered in the sterile environment of a private clinic in London. The words had hung in the air like a death sentence, changing everything in an instant. Catherine had felt William's hand tighten around hers as the specialist explained the aggressive nature of the condition, the limited treatment options, and the prognosis that no parent should ever have to hear. Their youngest had been experiencing symptoms for months. What they had initially dismissed as typical childhood ailments had gradually become more concerning. The frequent headaches, the sudden dizzy spells, unexplained fatigue that left their usually energetic child listless and pale. The royal physicians had run countless tests, each one bringing more questions than answers. Catherine remembered the exact moment when she knew something was seriously wrong. It was during a family dinner at Kensington Palace. Their child had suddenly stopped eating, pushing the plate away with a look of confusion that sent chills down her spine. When William had gently asked what was wrong, the response had been barely audible whisper about feeling strange inside their head. The next morning, they had driven to the hospital themselves, without the usual entourage of security and staff. Catherine had insisted on this small act of normalcy, wanting to maintain some semblance of being just ordinary parents dealing with their child's illness. The irony wasn't lost on her that even in their most private moments, they could never truly escape the weight of their public roles. Dr. Margaret Harrison, the pediatric specialist who had been treating their child, had become a familiar face. Over the past weeks, she was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had immediately put their family at ease. During their first consultation, she had spoken directly to their child, treating them not as a royal patient, but as any other young person facing a frightening medical situation. The test results had been devastating. The scans showed what no parent ever wants to see: shadows where there should be none. Abnormal growths that threatened everything they held dear. Dr. Harrison had explained the treatment protocol with careful precision, outlining the aggressive chemotherapy regimen that would be necessary, the potential side effects, and the uncertain outcome that lay ahead. William had remained stoic during the medical briefings, asking detailed questions about success rates, alternative treatments, and specialist consultations. But Catherine had seen the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking, the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee cup. They were both trying to be strong for their child and for each other, but the facade was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The palace staff had been informed on a need-to-know basis. Their private secretary, a loyal man who had served the family for over a decade, had immediately begun making discreet arrangements for the upcoming treatment schedule. Official engagements would need to be postponed or canceled. Public appearances would be limited. And a carefully crafted story would need to be prepared for when the media inevitably began asking questions about their reduced public schedule. Catherine's mother, Carol Middleton, had been one of the first people they had told. The conversation had taken place in the kitchen of the Middleton family home in Berkshire, a place where Catherine had always felt most like herself rather than a member of the royal family. Her mother's reaction had been immediate and fierce. She would do whatever was needed to support them. Through this ordeal, the other children in the family were still unaware of the full severity of the situation. William and Catherine had made the difficult decision to shield them from the worst details, at least for now. They were too young to fully understand the implications, and there was still hope that the treatment would be successful. Instead, they had explained that their sibling was sick and would need special medicine that might make them feel worse before they felt better. Prince George, being the eldest, had seemed to sense that something more serious was happening. He had become unusually quiet around the house, often found reading in corners or drawing pictures that he would quickly hide when adults approached. Princess Charlotte had responded with typical determination, announcing that she would take care of everyone and make sure her sibling took all their medicine. Prince Louis, still very young, seemed largely unaware that anything unusual was happening. The hardest part for Catherine was maintaining the pretense during their public appearances. Just 2 days after receiving the diagnosis, they had attended a charity gala where she had smiled for photographs and made small talk with donors, all while her mind was consumed with thoughts of treatment schedules and prognosis statistics. William had given a speech about the importance of supporting families in crisis, and Catherine had wondered if anyone in the audience could detect the personal anguish behind his carefully chosen words. Their relationship had been tested in ways they never could have imagined. Late at night, after the children were asleep, they would sit together in their private sitting room, sometimes talking through their fears and sometimes sitting in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The easy comfort they had always found in each other's company had been replaced by a tension born of shared worry and the terrible weight of having to make decisions that would affect their child's future. Medical appointments had become a regular part of their routine. The drive to the hospital had become achingly familiar, as had the antiseptic smell of the corridors and the hushed conversations with medical staff. Their child had been remarkably brave throughout the initial consultations, asking thoughtful questions and even making jokes to lighten the mood when the adults around them became too serious. As Catherine continued to stare out at the gardens, she realized that this was only the beginning of a journey that would test everything they thought they knew about strength, hope, and what it truly meant to be a family facing the unthinkable together. The treatment began on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. Catherine had spent the previous night lying awake, listening to William's restless breathing beside her, and watching the digital clock count down the hours until they would have to leave for the hospital. She had packed and repacked the small overnight bag 3 times, including favorite books, a worn stuffed animal, and the special blanket that had provided comfort during previous hospital stays. The pediatric oncology ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital had been specially prepared for their arrival. Despite their royal status, Dr. Harrison had insisted they be treated like any other family, with the same protocols and the same level of care that every child received. The only concession to their position was enhanced security in a private room that would allow them some measure of privacy during what was to come. Their child had been remarkably calm during the admission process, chatting with the nurses and showing interest in the colorful murals that decorated the corridors. Catherine had marveled at this resilience, wondering if children possessed some innate ability to adapt to circumstances that would overwhelm most adults. William had carried the overnight bag and maintained cheerful conversation, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The first chemotherapy session lasted nearly 6 hours. Catherine and William took turns sitting beside the hospital bed, reading stories and playing quiet games while the medication dripped slowly through the IV line. The nurses had warned them about the potential side effects: nausea, fatigue, hair loss, and a compromised immune system that would require careful monitoring. What they hadn't prepared them for was how helpless they would feel, watching their child endure treatment while being unable to take away the discomfort. By the 3rd day, the effects began to show. The vibrant energy that had always characterized their youngest began to fade, replaced by a listlessness that broke Catherine's heart. Meals became a struggle as nausea made eating difficult, and the once bright eyes became dull with exhaustion. William had taken to reading aloud for hours, his voice becoming hoarse as he worked through entire books in an effort to provide distraction from the physical discomfort. The palace had released a carefully worded statement about a family member receiving medical treatment without specifying details or revealing the seriousness of the condition. The media speculation had been immediate and intense, with photographers stationed outside the hospital and reporters calling sources within the royal household for information. Catherine found herself grateful for the tinted windows of their car and the discreet back entrance that allowed them to come and go without facing the cameras. Prince George had been the first to ask direct questions. about his sibling's condition. He had noticed the hair beginning to thin and the way their youngest moved more slowly than usual. William had sat down with him for a long conversation, explaining in age-appropriate terms about the medicine that was fighting the bad cells in the body and how it sometimes made people feel sick while it was working. George had listened solemnly and then asked if he could donate some of his own hair when his sibling lost theirs completely. The other children had responded in their own ways. Charlotte had begun drawing pictures of rainbows and unicorns, which she insisted had special healing powers and needed to be taped to the hospital room walls. Louis had started sharing his favorite toys, bringing them to his siblings' bedside with the serious explanation that they would help with feeling better. These small gestures of love and support had often moved Catherine to tears. When she thought no one was watching, the hardest moment came during the second week of treatment. Catherine had arrived at the hospital early, bringing fresh clothes and magazines only to find their child crying quietly in the hospital bed. The tears weren't from physical pain but from frustration and fear about the changes happening to their body. For the first time since the diagnosis, their youngest had asked the question that every parent dreads, "Am I going to die?" Catherine had climbed into the narrow hospital bed, pulling her child close and feeling the sharp edges of shoulder blades that seemed more prominent than they had been just weeks before. She had chosen her words carefully, explaining that the doctors were very smart and working very hard to make the medicine win against the sickness. She had promised that the entire family would fight together, that love was one of the strongest medicines of all. William had arrived an hour later to find them both asleep in the hospital bed, Catherine's arm protectively wrapped around their child. He had stood in the doorway for several minutes, taking in the scene that represented both his greatest love and his deepest fear. Later, when they were alone in the hospital corridor, he had finally allowed himself to cry. Leaning against the wall and letting the tears fall for the first time since the diagnosis, the treatment schedule became their new reality. 3 days. A week at the hospital, with careful monitoring in between. Their child's room at home had been transformed into a recovery space, with air purifiers, sanitized surfaces, and a strict protocol for visitors to prevent infection. Family gatherings became smaller and more careful, with everyone required to be healthy and follow hand-washing procedures that would have seemed excessive just months before. Catherine had started keeping a journal during the quiet hours at the hospital. She wrote about the small victories a day without nausea, a moment of laughter during treatment, the way their child's sense of humor remained intact even as their body struggled with the effects of chemotherapy. She also wrote about her fears, the what-if scenarios that plagued her during sleepless nights, and the guilt she felt about moments of anger at the unfairness of their situation. The medical team had become like extended family. Dr. Harrison checked in daily, even when she wasn't officially on duty. The nursing staff had learned their child's preferences, which flavors of ice chips were most appealing, which movies provided the best distraction, and which position was most comfortable during the long treatment sessions. These healthcare workers had seen countless families face similar challenges, yet they treated each case with fresh compassion and dedication. Public duties had been drastically reduced, though they couldn't be eliminated entirely. Catherine had attended a brief ceremony honoring healthcare workers, an appearance that felt particularly meaningful given their current circumstances. She had spoken briefly about the dedication of medical professionals and the strength of families facing health challenges. Words that carried a weight that few in the audience could have understood. The palace communications team had worked tirelessly to maintain privacy while managing public interest. Official photographs from recent family events were carefully selected to show their child looking healthy and happy, while candid shots that might reveal the physical effects of treatment were kept strictly private. The balance between transparency and protection felt like walking a tightrope, with the family's privacy on one side and public curiosity on the other. As the weeks progressed, Catherine began to understand that this experience was changing all of them in fundamental ways. The priorities that had once seemed so important, public appearances, social obligations, even some aspects of royal protocol, had faded in significance. Compared to the simple desire to see their child healthy and happy again, this shift in perspective was both liberating and terrifying, as it highlighted just how much they had to lose. The turning point came during the 4th week of treatment, though at the time it felt more like a devastating blow than any kind of progress. Catherine had arrived at the hospital for what should have been a routine checkup, expecting the usual blood tests and consultation with Dr. Harrison. Instead, she found herself sitting in a small conference room with William, facing a team of specialists whose expressions told her everything she needed to know before they spoke a single word. "Doctor." Harrison spoke gently, but directly. The latest scans showed that the tumor was not responding to the current treatment protocol as they had hoped. While it hadn't grown significantly, it also hadn't shrunk to the degree that would indicate the chemotherapy was effectively fighting the cancer. They needed to discuss more aggressive options, including experimental treatments that carried greater risks, but potentially offered better outcomes. William had reached for Catherine's hand under the conference table, their fingers intertwining in a grip that felt like their only anchor in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. The specialists explained clinical trials, immunotherapy options, and the possibility of surgery that would be incredibly complex and carried significant risks. Each option came with statistics and probabilities that reduced their child's life, 2 percentages and survival rates. The drive home from the hospital that day had been conducted in complete silence. Both Catherine and William were lost in their own thoughts, processing information that seemed too overwhelming to discuss immediately. It wasn't until they were safely behind the doors of their private residence that Catherine finally broke down completely, sobbing with a grief that came from somewhere deeper than she had known existed. Their child, meanwhile, had shown remarkable maturity in the face of the changing treatment plan. When Dr. Harrison had explained that they would need to try different medicines that might work better, the response had been a simple nod and a question about whether the new treatment would still allow time for reading stories with Papa. This innocent acceptance of circumstances beyond their control had been both heartbreaking and inspiring for Catherine and William to witness. The decision to pursue experimental treatment meant traveling to a specialized facility in Switzerland, where a groundbreaking immunotherapy program was showing promising results for pediatric cases similar to theirs. The logistics of arranging this trip, while maintaining security protocols and privacy, had been enormously complicated, requiring coordination between multiple governments and medical institutions. Catherine had spent hours researching the Swiss facility, reading every available study and connecting with other families who had participated in the program. Success stories gave her hope, while the cases that hadn't ended well kept her awake at night. She found herself caught between the desire to know everything possible about their child's condition and the need to maintain enough optimism to get through each day. The other children had begun to show signs of stress, despite their parents' efforts to maintain normalcy. George had become quieter and more serious, often found sitting by himself with a book, but not actually reading. Charlotte had started having nightmares and would appear in her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night, seeking comfort that Catherine and William struggled to provide while dealing with their own fears. Louis, being younger, seemed to sense the tension in the house without understanding its source, leading to more frequent tantrums and clingy behavior. Carol Middleton had moved into Kensington Palace temporarily to help with the children and provide additional support during this difficult time. Her presence had been a blessing, bringing a sense of normalcy and unconditional love that helped stabilize the household. She had taken over many of the daily routines with the children, allowing Catherine and William to focus their energy on medical decisions and spending quality time with their sick child. The preparation for Switzerland had been emotionally exhausting. Catherine had packed clothes for an extended stay, not knowing how long the treatment would take or what the outcome might be. I had included photo albums, favorite books, and small mementos from home, trying to create some sense of familiarity in what would be a completely foreign environment. The night before their departure, William had tucked each of the children into bed with extra care, spending individual time with George, Charlotte, and Louis to reassure them about the trip and promise regular video calls. Catherine had overheard him explaining to George that he was the big brother and would need to help take care of everyone while they were away. The weight of responsibility being placed on such young shoulders had made her heart ache. The flight to Switzerland had been arranged with medical personnel on board, in case any complications arose during travel. Their child had slept foremost of the journey, curled up between Catherine and William with a blanket that smelled like home. Catherine had spent the flight looking out the window at the clouds below, wondering if other passengers could sense the gravity of their situation, or, if they simply appeared to be a family taking a vacation. The Swiss medical facility was unlike anything Catherine had experienced. The building was modern and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Alps. The staff spoke multiple languages and had extensive experience working with international patients. Most importantly, they specialized in cases that other institutions had deemed too challenging or experimental for traditional treatment. Dr. Klaus Müller, the lead physician for the immunotherapy program, had met with them on their first day to review their child's complete medical history and explain the treatment protocol in detail. The process would involve reprogramming the body's own immune system to better recognize and fight the cancer cells, essentially turning their child's natural defenses into a more powerful weapon against the disease. The treatment itself was less visually dramatic than chemotherapy, but potentially more complex in its effects. Instead of the drip bags and monitoring equipment they had become accustomed to, immunotherapy involved a series of injections and careful observation of how the body's immune system responded. The real challenge would be waiting to see if the treatment worked, a process that could take weeks or even months to evaluate properly. Catherine had established a routine during their stay in Switzerland. Mornings were spent at the medical facility. Afternoons were for rest and recovery, and evenings were reserved for video calls with the other children back home. She had found a small cafe near their temporary accommodation where she could sit alone for an hour each day, drinking coffee and writing in her journal, while trying to process the emotional roller coaster they were all experiencing. The Swiss Alps visible from their window provided a sense of perspective that Catherine found both comforting and overwhelming. The mountains had stood unchanged for thousands of years, witnessing countless human dramas play out in their shadow. Sometimes this made her feel insignificant in the face of such permanence, while other times it reminded her that people had been facing impossible challenges and finding ways to endure for as long as humans had existed. William had thrown himself into learning everything possible about the treatment they were pursuing. He spent hours in conversation with Dr. Müller and the research team, asking detailed questions about success rates, potential complications, and long-term effects. Catherine recognized this as his way of coping by gathering information and understanding every aspect of their situation. He could maintain some sense of control in circumstances that were largely beyond their influence. 3 weeks into the experimental treatment in Switzerland, Catherine noticed the first subtle signs that something might be changing. Their child seemed to have more energy during the afternoons, showing interest in activities that had been abandoned during the worst days of chemotherapy. The appetite was slowly returning, and there were moments of genuine laughter that hadn't been heard in months. Catherine hardly dared to hope, but she found herself watching for these small improvements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Dr. Müller had warned them that the immunotherapy could take time to show results, and that initial improvements might be temporary as the body adjusted to the treatment. The weekly scans would provide the real indication of whether the therapy was working. But those results were still days away. Catherine had learned to live in a state of suspended anticipation, celebrating tiny victories while preparing herself for potential disappointment. William had established his own routine during their Swiss stay. Each morning, he would go for a run through the streets near their accommodation, using the physical exertion to manage the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him if he remained still for too long. These runs had become his meditation, his way of processing the fear and hope that battled constantly in his mind. Upon returning, he would shower and transform back into the calm, supportive father and husband that his family needed him to be. The video calls with the children back home had become both a lifeline and a source of additional stress. George, Charlotte, and Louis were clearly struggling with the separation. Despite Carol Middleton's devoted care and the efforts of the palace staff to maintain their normal routines, George had become increasingly serious in his demeanor, asking pointed questions about when they would return and whether his sibling was getting better. Charlotte had started making elaborate craft projects that she insisted needed to be shipped to Switzerland immediately, while Louis simply wanted to know why everyone seemed sad when they talked to him. Catherine had begun to understand that this experience was fundamentally changing their family dynamic. The crisis had stripped away many of the formal protocols and structured interactions that characterized royal family life, placing them with raw emotional honesty that was both frightening and liberating. She and William were communicating with a directness that their relationship had never required before, discussing fears and possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable. Just months earlier, the Swiss medical team had become deeply invested in their case, partly because of their royal status but primarily because their child represented exactly the type of challenging case that the experimental program was designed to address. Dr. Mueller had explained that pediatric cases often responded differently to immunotherapy than adult patients, sometimes showing dramatic improvements that defied statistical predictions. This knowledge provided hope, but also added pressure to a situation that already felt overwhelmingly significant. The first scan results came on a Thursday morning that had dawned gray and drizzly, with low clouds obscuring the mountain peaks. That had become Catherine's daily reference point for stability. She and William sat in Dr. Muller's office, holding hands and trying to read the expression on his face as he reviewed the images on his computer screen. The silence stretched. For what felt like hours before he finally turned to face them with a smile that transformed everything, the tumor had shrunk by 30%. The aggressive growth that had characterized the cancer during the initial diagnosis had not only stopped, but had begun to reverse. Dr. Mueller explained that this level of response so early in the treatment was exceptionally encouraging, though he cautioned that they needed to continue the therapy and monitor progress carefully. Still, for the first time in months, Catherine allowed herself to feel genuine hope. Their child had taken the news with the same remarkable composure that had characterized their entire approach to the illness. When told that the medicine was working very well and that the bad cells were getting smaller, the response had been a thoughtful nod, followed by a question about whether this meant they could go home soon. The innocence and resilience displayed throughout this ordeal had been a constant source of strength for Catherine and William, even as it broke their hearts to witness such courage in someone so young. The celebration that night had been quiet, but profound. Catherine and William had taken their child to a small restaurant in the village, where they ordered pizza and talked about plans for when they returned home. For the first time in months, the conversation focused on the future rather than just getting through each day. They discussed upcoming birthdays, Christmas plans, and summer holidays with a sense of possibility that had been absent since the diagnosis. Back in London, the news had been shared with the immediate family, though the palace had decided to wait before making any public announcements. The extended family's reaction had been overwhelming relief mixed with cautious optimism. Prince Charles had flown to Switzerland immediately upon hearing the results, arriving with tears in his eyes and arms full of gifts for his grandchild. His presence had provided additional emotional support for Catherine and William, who had been carrying the burden of this crisis largely alone. The treatment protocol required several more weeks in Switzerland, followed by ongoing monitoring and maintenance therapy that could continue for months or even years. Dr. Mueller had explained that the goal was to retrain the immune system permanently, creating lasting protection against the cancer's return. This meant that their lives would continue to be shaped by medical appointments and careful health monitoring. But the prognosis had shifted from uncertain to hopeful. Catherine had begun planning their return to London, thinking about how to readjust their family life to accommodate continued treatment while gradually resuming some of their royal duties. The experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on what was truly important, and she knew that their approach to public service would need to reflect these new priorities. The traditional royal schedule of appearances and obligations would need to be balanced against the needs of their family in ways they had never considered before. The other children's excitement about their siblings improving health had been evident during their video calls. Charlotte had announced that she was planning a welcome home party with decorations and a special cake. George had begun reading books about science and medicine, declaring his intention to become a doctor so he could help other children who got sick. Louis had simply repeated over and over that he missed everyone and wanted them to come home right away. William had started having conversations with palace officials about gradually returning to public duties, but with a completely different approach than they had maintained before the illness. Family time would be protected more fiercely, and their children's privacy would be guarded even more carefully. The experience had taught them that their roles as parents needed to take priority over their roles as working royals, even if this meant disappointing some traditional expectations. The Swiss medical team had begun discussing the transition back to London, where their child's care would be transferred to specialists at Great Ormond Street Hospital, who had been collaborating with Dr. Mueller throughout the treatment. The continuity of care was crucial, as the immunotherapy would require ongoing monitoring and potential adjustments. Based on how the body continued to respond to the treatment, Catherine had spent an entire afternoon walking through the Swiss village, reflecting on how much their lives had changed over the past few months. The person who had arrived in Switzerland weeks earlier had been consumed by fear and uncertainty, and while still cautious about the future, she felt a strength and clarity about what truly mattered that she had never possessed before. The experience had been devastating, but it had also revealed reserves of love, courage, and resilience that she hadn't known existed within their family. The journey back to London felt surreal after 2 months in Switzerland. Catherine sat beside their child on the private plane, watching the familiar English countryside appear below the clouds and feeling a complex mixture of relief and anxiety about returning home. The successful treatment had given them hope, but she knew that the real test would be integrating back into their regular life while maintaining the medical vigilance that their child's condition still required. Kensington Palace had been transformed during their absence. The other children had worked with their grandmother to create welcome home banners that hung from every available surface. And Charlotte had indeed organized the elaborate homecoming party she had promised during their video calls. The reunion was emotional for everyone, tears of joy and relief flowing freely as the family was finally together, again after the longest separation they had ever experienced. The transition back to London-based medical care had been carefully coordinated between Dr. Mueller and the team at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Catherine found herself back in familiar corridors, but now with a fundamentally different perspective on their child's treatment. The fear and uncertainty that had characterized their earlier visits had been replaced by cautious optimism and a deep appreciation for the medical professionals who had become such an important part of their lives. Dr. Harrison had reviewed all the Swiss treatment records and imaging results with obvious satisfaction. The progress that had begun in Switzerland was continuing, follow-up scans showing further shrinkage of the tumor and blood work indicating that the immune system was maintaining its enhanced ability to fight the cancer cells. The experimental treatment had exceeded everyone's expectations. Though the medical team emphasized the importance of continued monitoring and maintenance therapy, William had gradually begun resuming some of his royal duties, but with a completely different approach than before their child's illness. He had declined several high-profile engagements, and instead chosen to focus on causes related to healthcare and family support services. His first public speech after returning from Switzerland had been at a fundraising event for pediatric cancer research, where he spoke with a passion and personal understanding that moved many in the audience to tears. Catherine had been more selective about her return to public life, choosing engagements that felt meaningful rather than simply fulfilling traditional obligations. Her first official appearance had been a visit to a support group for parents of children with serious illnesses, where she had spoken openly about the challenges of navigating the healthcare system and the importance of maintaining hope during the darkest moments. Her words carried a weight and authenticity that came from lived experience rather than prepared remarks. The children had all been affected by the experience in different ways. George had indeed pursued his interest in science and medicine, reading advanced books and asking sophisticated questions about how the immune system worked. His teachers at school had remarked on his increased maturity and his new tendency to look out for classmates who seemed unwell or upset. The experience had aged him in some ways, but it also revealed a compassion and strength that made Catherine proud. Charlotte had channeled her emotions into creative expression, producing an endless stream of artwork, stories, and craft projects that reflected her processing of the family's ordeal. Many of her drawings featured families staying together and people helping each other, themes that clearly resonated with her understanding of what they had been through. Her natural optimism had been a source of light during the darkest moments and continued to lift everyone's spirits during the recovery period. Louis, being the youngest, had been most affected by the disruption to his routine and the separation from his parents and sibling. He had become more clingy and needed extra reassurance, but had also developed a protective instinct toward his recovering sibling that was touching to witness. He would quietly bring toys and snacks without being asked, and had appointed himself as the official guardian of the daily medication schedule. The maintenance therapy required regular hospital visits, but these had become routine rather than traumatic. Their child had adapted remarkably well to the ongoing treatment, viewing the medical appointments as just another part of life rather than something to be feared. The resilience displayed throughout the entire experience continued to amaze Catherine and William, serving as a constant reminder of the strength that children could demonstrate when faced with circumstances beyond their control. Palace Communications had finally released a carefully worded statement about their child's successful treatment, acknowledging the illness publicly for the first time while maintaining privacy about specific medical details. The public response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with thousands of letters and cards arriving from well-wishers around the world. Catherine had been moved by the stories shared by other families who had faced similar challenges, creating a sense of connection and shared experience that transcended their royal status. The experience had fundamentally changed Catherine and William's approach to their roles within the royal family. They had gained a new understanding of what truly mattered, and had developed the confidence to prioritize their family's needs, even when it conflicted with traditional expectations. This shift had been noticed and largely supported by other members of the royal family, who had witnessed firsthand the dedication and strength that Catherine and William had shown during the crisis. Their marriage had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but had ultimately been strengthened by the shared experience of fighting for their child's life. They had learned to communicate with a directness and vulnerability that their relationship had never required before, and had discovered reserves of mutual support that they hadn't known existed. The easy companionship of their earlier married life had been replaced by something deeper and more intentional. The daily routine at home had been restructured around their child's continued recovery and the family's new understanding of what was important. Meals were eaten together whenever possible, bedtime stories were prioritized over official paperwork, and weekend family activities took precedence over social obligations. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting a fundamental shift in how they viewed their responsibilities as parents versus their duties as working royals. Catherine had continued keeping her journal throughout the recovery period, documenting not just the medical milestones, but also the small moments of joy and normalcy that felt precious after months of uncertainty. She wrote about lazy Sunday mornings when all the children piled into their bed, about family game nights that lasted hours past bedtime, and about the simple pleasure of planning future vacations without worrying about treatment schedules. The question of when and how to share their story more publicly had been an ongoing discussion. They had received requests from documentary makers, journalists, and charitable organizations who wanted to highlight their experience as a way of supporting other families facing similar challenges. Catherine and William were considering these opportunities carefully, wanting to use their platform to help others while still protecting their family's privacy and their child's right to a normal life moving forward. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since the initial diagnosis, Catherine reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed. The fear and uncertainty of those early months seemed almost surreal now, though she knew that the experience would always be part of their family's story. More importantly, it had taught them lessons about love, resilience, and what it meant to face impossible challenges together that would continue to shape their lives for years to come. 1 year after the initial diagnosis, Catherine stood in the same hospital corridor where she and William had first heard the devastating news that would change their lives forever. This time, however, she was accompanied by their child, who, was skipping beside her with an energy and vitality that seemed miraculous compared to the pale, exhausted patient who had begun treatment 12 months earlier. They were here for what Dr. Harrison had described as a milestone appointment. The 1-year scan that would determine the long-term success of the experimental treatment. The waiting room felt different now, no longer experienced the crushing anxiety that had characterized their earlier visits. Instead, she felt a quiet confidence, born from witnessing her child's remarkable recovery and the gradual return to normal life that had defined the past few months. Their child was chatting animatedly with William about a school project, displaying the same intellectual curiosity and boundless enthusiasm that had worried them might be lost forever during the darkest days of treatment. Dr. Harrison emerged from her office with a smile that Catherine had learned to read as genuinely positive rather than professionally reassuring. The scan results were everything they had hoped for and more. Not only had the tumor continued to shrink, but the latest imaging showed no detectable cancer cells remaining in their child's body. The experimental immunotherapy had achieved what traditional treatment had failed to accomplish: complete remission with no signs of the aggressive cancer that had threatened to take everything they held dear. The celebration that followed was subdued but deeply meaningful.
No.
Their child's response to the news had been characteristically practical, asking if this meant no more hospital visits and whether they could finally get the puppy they had been requesting for months. Catherine and William had exchanged a look that conveyed volumes: relief, gratitude, and amazement at the resilience their family had discovered during this ordeal. The drive home from the hospital took them past landmarks that had taken on new significance over the past year. The park where they had often stopped to walk during treatment breaks. The small cafe where Catherine had spent countless hours on the phone with worried family members. In the flower shop where William had bought weekly bouquets to brighten their child's hospital room. Each location held memories of the journey they had traveled together, markers of a transformation that had affected every aspect of their lives. That evening, the entire extended family gathered at Kensington Palace for an impromptu celebration dinner. Prince Charles arrived with a specially commissioned piece of artwork depicting the Swiss mountains where their child had received the life-saving treatment. The Queen had sent a personal letter expressing her pride in the family's courage and her joy at their child's recovery. Even Prince Harry had managed to join them via video call from his home abroad, his emotional reaction to the news serving as a reminder of how deeply the crisis had affected everyone who loved them. The other children had planned their own celebration, complete with homemade decorations and a cake that Charlotte had insisted on baking herself. George had prepared a speech about the importance of never giving up, while Louis had simply announced that now they could all be happy again. The innocence and wisdom of their responses highlighted how much the entire family had grown during this challenging period. Catherine had spent weeks preparing for this moment, found herself surprisingly emotional now that it had arrived. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the realization of how much their lives had been shaped by the constant presence of uncertainty and fear. Learning to live without that background anxiety would be its own adjustment, requiring them to rediscover what normal life looked like for their family. William had already begun making plans for the future that reflected their new priorities and perspectives. He had accepted a patronage with the organization that had funded the Swiss research facility, committing to help raise awareness and support for experimental treatments that could benefit other families facing similar diagnoses. His personal experience had given him a platform and credibility that he intended to use to make a meaningful difference in pediatric cancer research. The question of privacy versus public sharing had been resolved through careful consideration of what would benefit other families while protecting their own child's right to a normal future. They had agreed to participate in a documentary about the experimental treatment program, the understanding that their child's identity would be carefully protected, that the focus would be on the medical breakthrough rather than their personal story. Catherine had decided to write a book about their experience, working with a ghostwriter to create a resource for other parents navigating similar challenges. The project would donate all proceeds to pediatric cancer research and support services for families dealing with serious childhood illnesses. She had been surprised by how therapeutic the writing process had become, allowing her to process emotions and insights that she was still discovering months after the worst of the crisis had passed. Their child had returned to school full-time, joining classmates who had been carefully prepared by teachers and administrators to welcome them back without making the medical experience the defining aspect of their identity. The transition had been smoother than expected, with friendships resuming naturally and academic performance quickly returning to previous levels. Most remarkably, their child seemed to have integrated the experience as simply one part of their life story, rather than allowing it to become the central defining narrative. The family's approach to royal duties had permanently shifted to prioritize meaningful engagement over traditional protocol. Catherine and William had become more selective about their commitments, choosing causes and appearances that aligned with their values and allowed them to make genuine contributions, rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. This change had been noticed and largely supported by the public, who seemed to appreciate the authenticity that came from their lived experience. The daily routines at home had settled into a new normal that incorporated lessons learned during the medical crisis. Family time was protected more fiercely, with evening meals together becoming non-negotiable regardless of official schedules. Weekend activities focused on simple pleasures, walks in the countryside, games in the garden, and quiet evenings reading together. The elaborate social calendar that had once dominated their lives had been replaced by a more intentional approach to how they spent their time. As Catherine tucked their recovered child into bed that night, she was struck by how ordinary the moment felt. The elaborate medical equipment, careful monitoring, and constant vigilance that had characterized bedtime routines for months had been replaced by the simple pleasure of reading a story and discussing plans for the next day. The normalcy that she had once taken for granted now felt like a precious gift that would never be underappreciated again. The experience had taught their entire family lessons about resilience, love, and what truly mattered that would continue to influence their choices for years to come. They had discovered strength they didn't know they possessed, developed a deeper appreciation for everyday moments, and gained a perspective on their roles and responsibilities that was grounded in genuine understanding of human vulnerability and hope. Looking toward the future, Catherine felt a sense of possibility that was both exciting and peaceful. Their child would grow up with the knowledge that they had faced something frightening and emerged stronger, surrounded by family members who had proven their commitment through the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The silent farewell they had feared would never come to pass, replaced instead by a celebration of life, love, and the extraordinary power of families to endure and thrive together, no matter what challenges they might face.